When Karen launched a petty feud over mailboxes, she had no idea she'd pull back the curtain on a massive police scam that rocked the entire community and changed everything forever. The controversy began when Karen, a longtime resident with a reputation for controlling tendencies, turned her attention to the neighborhood's mailboxes. Initially, her complaints appeared trivial: chip paint, slightly tilted posts, or minor rust on metal parts. Karen argued that these small defects degraded the overall appearance and property values of the community. Although many homeowners dismissed her concerns as nitpicking, Karen refused to let the issue go. Karen began systematically inspecting each mailbox on her daily walks, making notes, taking photographs, and documenting anything she considered a violation of community standards. She compiled detailed lists categorizing alleged offenses, from faded numbers to mailbox doors that did not close perfectly. Karen sent formal complaints to the Homeowners Association, HOA, demanding immediate enforcement of strict mailbox maintenance rules. At first, the HOA board treated Karen's complaints as minor. Mailbox wear and tear had never been a significant concern for the community, and no prior board had prioritized such small cosmetic issues. However, Karen was relentless. She cited vague language buried deep in the HOA's governing documents, claiming that homeowners were required to maintain their properties, including mailboxes, in good condition and uniform appearance. Although the rule had never been strictly enforced, its existence gave Karen a foothold. As weeks passed, Karen's efforts escalated. She sent multiple emails to the board, attended every HOA meeting, and demanded written responses to her complaints. Feeling pressured to appease her and avoid accusations of negligence, the HOA board eventually conceded. They issued a formal notice to all homeowners, reminding them to inspect and maintain their mailboxes according to community standards. The notice cited Karen's interpretation of the bylaws and warned that failure to comply could result in fines. This move immediately caused resentment among residents. Many saw the crackdown as unnecessary, petty, and driven by one individual's obsession rather than any genuine community concern. Some homeowners repaired or replaced their mailboxes to avoid conflict, but others pushed back, arguing that the enforcement was unreasonable and lacked proper due process. The sudden focus on minor cosmetic issues disrupted the once peaceful neighborhood dynamic. Karen took the HOA's notice as a personal victory and doubled down on her efforts. She began submitting formal violation reports against specific neighbors who had not yet repaired their mailboxes to her satisfaction. She demanded that the HOA issue fines promptly and consistently, often forwarding photographs as evidence. Her constant complaints overwhelmed the HOA's compliance officer, creating tension within the board itself. In response to growing resistance from homeowners, Karen began contacting local authorities. She claimed that poorly maintained mailboxes violated city ordinances related to property standards and public safety. In her complaints, she exaggerated the risks, suggesting that rusted mailboxes posed hazards to mail carriers or that leaning posts obstructed sidewalks. Although most of her concerns were dismissed by city officials as non-urgent, a few officers responded to her calls out of courtesy, which emboldened her further. Karen's aggressive tactics widened the rift within the community. Neighbors who had previously been friendly now avoided each other, fearing that casual conversations could be used against them in future complaints. Divisions grew as some residents reluctantly supported compliance to avoid trouble, while others dug in their heels, determined not to be bullied into unnecessary repairs. The HOA's involvement deepened when a few board members, weary of Karen's relentless pressure, proposed instituting formal inspections of all mailboxes twice a year. This measure passed narrowly, and an inspection schedule was created. Karen was informally given authority to assist in inspections, further blurring the line between a concerned resident and an unofficial enforcer. Residents were outraged, feeling that one person's vendetta had effectively rewritten the rules for the entire community. Financial concerns also emerged. The HOA announced that failure to comply with mailbox standards could result in escalating fines, beginning with warnings and moving to monetary penalties if repairs were not made within specified deadlines. Homeowners questioned the legality of these fines and demanded clear documentation showing where in the governing documents such authority was granted. The HOA provided vague responses, citing the general maintenance clause, but offering little specific legal justification for Karen's extreme interpretation. The mailbox dispute, initially a minor annoyance, grew into a defining issue that overshadowed all other neighborhood concerns. Karen's efforts had transformed an insignificant aesthetic matter into a source of community-wide stress, distrust, and division. Homeowners' meetings became contentious battlegrounds, with shouting matches and accusations flying across the room. Long-standing friendships eroded under the strain of constant surveillance and reporting. The tension laid the foundation for what would come next. As Karen's obsession with mailbox violations grew, and her demands for official enforcement increased, more and more homeowners began to notice unusual patterns in how citations were issued and who was being targeted. Questions arose about the role of local law enforcement in the mailbox crackdown and whether their involvement was legitimate or something far more sinister. Karen's initial battle over mailboxes, intended to impose her version of perfection on the community, instead exposed vulnerabilities within the HOA structure and opened the door to abuses of power. Her actions inadvertently created the conditions necessary for uncovering a far larger scandal, one that went far beyond chipped paint and rusty hinges. After weeks of escalating mailbox complaints, Karen began involving local law enforcement in matters that traditionally fell under the HOA's purview. Claiming public safety concerns, she contacted the police department multiple times, reporting mailboxes she considered hazardous. Initially, her reports received little attention, but persistence led to eventual responses from certain officers who appeared unusually eager to assist. Homeowners were shocked to see uniformed officers inspecting private mailboxes and issuing formal warnings. Some residents, assuming it was standard procedure, complied immediately, believing they had violated municipal codes. However, confusion soon set in. Most homeowners had never heard of any city ordinance regulating the cosmetic maintenance of mailboxes. Moreover, the aggressive posture of officers over minor aesthetic issues seemed highly irregular. Fines and citations began appearing in residents' mail, citing vague violations of public safety laws. The infractions were often accompanied by demands for immediate payment to avoid further penalties. These citations carried official-looking seals and referenced municipal codes that, when researched, did not directly apply to private mailbox maintenance. The language used in the citations was intentionally confusing, designed to create fear and encourage quick compliance. As the number of citations grew, residents started noticing disturbing patterns. The homeowners who had been most vocal in opposing Karen's mailbox campaign were receiving multiple citations, sometimes for infractions that did not even exist. In contrast, residents who had complied with Karen's earlier demands or maintained friendly relations with her were largely left alone. The selective enforcement raised suspicions about possible coordination between Karen and specific members of the police department. Residents also observed that the same small group of officers repeatedly responded to Karen's complaints. These officers showed up even for minor grievances, such as slightly leaning mailbox posts or fading paint, often treating the situations with unwarranted severity. In some cases, officers issued fines without even speaking to homeowners, leaving citations attached to mailboxes or taped to front doors. The sudden surge in enforcement had financial consequences. Homeowners who failed to pay fines promptly were threatened with additional penalties, legal action, and potential liens against their properties. Many residents, fearing costly legal battles, chose to pay the fines without contest, even when they doubted their legitimacy. This created a lucrative stream of money that seemed disproportionate to the minor nature of the alleged violations. Concern grew when residents realized that the payments were not being directed to the city's standard payment portals. Instead, citations instructed homeowners to mail checks to a private P.O. box address listed as the Municipal Enforcement Fund. Attempts to verify this entity revealed no official connection to the local government. Alarm bells rang louder as more homeowners cross-referenced citations and found inconsistencies in officer names, badge numbers, and fine schedules. A few vigilant residents began digging deeper. They requested public records regarding the issuance of citations and the involvement of officers in property maintenance disputes. The city's initial response was evasive, citing privacy concerns and bureaucratic delays. However, persistent requests and pressure eventually forced disclosures that revealed critical information. The citations were not authorized through official city channels, but were part of an off-the-books initiative launched by a small group of rogue officers seeking to generate extra income. Karen's endless complaints had inadvertently given these officers the opportunity they needed. By leveraging Karen's exaggerations and community fear, they created a system where minor infractions were monetized outside formal legal processes. Their scheme relied on the assumption that most homeowners would not question minor fines, preferring to pay small amounts rather than fight lengthy legal battles. The scale of the scam became clearer as residents compared notes. Dozens of households had received citations over the span of a few months, often citing the same ambiguous public nuisance codes. Some families had been fined multiple times for the same mailbox, even after making repairs. The frequency and randomness of the fines suggested that the operation was less about community standards and more about financial exploitation. As frustration grew, homeowners banded together to form an informal investigative committee. They pooled information, shared photographs of the citations, and tracked the activities of responding officers. Patterns of abuse became undeniable. The committee also reached out to media outlets, seeking broader exposure and protection from potential retaliation. Homeowners who initially believed they were isolated cases realized they were part of a broader network of victims. This shared sense of injustice galvanized the community to take collective action. Meetings were organized, attorneys were consulted, and formal complaints were filed with higher law enforcement oversight bodies. Karen's role in the scheme, while likely unintentional, became a subject of intense anger. Her actions had created the perfect environment for corrupt officers to exploit residents. Although she might have genuinely believed she was improving the neighborhood, her relentless mailbox war had opened the door to systematic abuse and financial exploitation. The entire situation shifted from a local dispute to a full-blown scandal, with homeowners now demanding accountability not just from the rogue officers, but also from the HOA board and city officials who had allowed the situation to escalate unchecked. As the mailbox citations continued to flood the neighborhood, many residents began to question the legitimacy of the fines they were receiving. Initially, the fines were seen as a minor inconvenience, but as the volume of citations grew, concerns about the accuracy of the tickets started to mount. Homeowners who had never received a single complaint in the past were suddenly inundated with notices citing vague violations, often for issues as trivial as rust on a mailbox hinge or slightly faded numbers. The lack of consistency in ticketing soon became apparent, leading to growing skepticism among the affected residents. One of the first signs that something was wrong came when several homeowners compared the dates and details on their citations. They noticed that in some cases, the fines were issued on days when they had not even been home or had not made any changes to their mailboxes. There were discrepancies in the addresses listed on the citations, with some residents finding that the tickets referenced mailboxes that did not even belong to them. Additionally, several citations were marked with an officer's name that was either incorrect or could not be verified by the local police department. These inconsistencies prompted many residents to look closer at the pattern of enforcement. Some of the more tech-savvy homeowners began taking photos of their mailboxes after they had made repairs or maintained them, ensuring that there was a clear record of their compliance. When new citations appeared despite these efforts, suspicions grew that something more than simple mistakes was at play. Some residents even noted that the fines were being issued with increasing frequency, despite their efforts to address the minor issues Karen had complained about, such as repainting their mailboxes or straightening the posts. It seemed as though there was no end in sight. As the number of complaints grew, a few brave homeowners decided to take matters into their own hands. They began gathering copies of the citations they had received and cross-referencing them with their neighbors' records. In some cases, they discovered that multiple residents had received tickets for the same alleged violation at almost the same time. This raised further questions about whether the citations were being issued randomly or if a concerted effort was being made to target specific properties. The pattern of errors became more apparent when residents started documenting the details of the officers who had issued the citations. Some officers were mentioned multiple times in the same neighborhood over short periods of time, with no logical explanation for their increased involvement. A few homeowners managed to identify that these officers were not assigned to typical patrol duties in the area, but instead seemed to be focused entirely on the mailbox enforcement campaign. This selective and highly unusual attention from law enforcement only served to deepen the sense of suspicion. The final straw for many residents came when they discovered that a small number of officers who had issued the majority of the citations were involved in discrepancies within their own records. A deeper dive into public records revealed that these officers had been previously investigated for other questionable activities, though none of the investigations had led to significant actions or consequences. This raised serious concerns about the integrity of the officers involved in the mailbox citations and whether they were operating under the radar of higher authorities. Faced with these mounting inconsistencies, a small group of concerned homeowners began to organize. They reached out to their neighbors, urging them to keep detailed records of any citations they received and to share any experiences related to the officers involved. The group also began to coordinate with legal experts, hoping to uncover any formal complaints or internal investigations that might have been overlooked by the local authorities. It was clear that these citations were not the result of a few administrative mistakes, but were part of a much larger pattern of questionable activity. As the investigation gained momentum, more residents came forward with their own suspicions. Some recalled seeing the same officers in the neighborhood at odd hours when they should have been patrolling other areas. Others claimed to have overheard conversations where these officers discussed their methods for issuing fines. The community was beginning to recognize that this wasn't just about Karen's obsession with mailboxes. It was about something much larger, a coordinated effort between rogue officers and an individual who had unwittingly given them the power to exploit the neighborhood. What was once a seemingly small dispute over mailbox maintenance was now beginning to reveal itself as a deeply rooted problem. Homeowners realized that if they did not act swiftly and decisively, they could become victims of a much larger scheme, one that involved not just minor infractions, but the potential for financial exploitation and corruption within their own community. They recognized that their best chance of uncovering the truth lay in collective action. As more residents shared their findings, the group of concerned homeowners began to piece together the full extent of the operation. The more they investigated, the clearer it became that the officers involved had been using their authority to create an illusion of widespread violations. The officers capitalized on the fear and confusion created by Karen's incessant complaints, knowing that many residents would not question the legitimacy of official-looking citations, especially when they came from law enforcement. The increasing sense of solidarity among residents helped to strengthen their resolve. They realized that their collective power was the key to holding those responsible accountable. Armed with evidence and a growing sense of unity, they prepared to escalate their efforts, reaching out to the media, contacting local government officials, and demanding an official investigation into the actions of the officers and the HOA board. The cracks in the police and HOA's authority were now wide enough for the community to push back and demand justice. The tipping point came when a group of residents, having collected overwhelming evidence of inconsistencies and irregularities in the citation process, demanded a formal investigation into the actions of both the police officers and the HOA. They submitted their findings to the local government and law enforcement, pressuring officials to examine the pattern of citations issued, the officers involved, and the bizarre circumstances surrounding the whole situation. What initially seemed like an isolated incident of petty disputes over mailbox aesthetics quickly snowballed into an elaborate and far-reaching corruption scandal. It didn't take long for investigators to uncover a network of rogue officers who were systematically issuing fake citations, generating a steady stream of income from fines that had no legal basis. The officers involved had been using their official positions to target specific homeowners, issuing fines for vague, often non-existent violations, and funneling the payments into a private account that had no official connection to the city's revenue system. The most shocking discovery, however, was that the officers had been using Karen's relentless complaints to bolster their scam. While Karen may have started with good intentions, her obsessive focus on mailbox violations had inadvertently created the perfect cover for the scheme. The officers had taken advantage of Karen's position as a vocal enforcer of HOA rules. They relied on her reports and complaints to fuel their operation. Karen's persistent insistence that the neighborhood's mailboxes were a public nuisance provided them with the pretext they needed to issue citations for minor infractions. What started as an attempt to impose stricter rules on mailbox aesthetics had unknowingly turned into a gold mine for the corrupt officers. They used Karen's complaints as justification to target residents, knowing that the HOA and police would support them, and homeowners would be hesitant to challenge fines issued by law enforcement. At the heart of the scam was a kickback system that allowed officers to pocket a portion of the fines collected. The corrupt officers had enlisted the help of a few HOA members who were willing to turn a blind eye or actively collude in the scheme. These individuals helped ensure that the citations were properly filed and that the fines were sent to the officer's private account, not the official city revenue fund. In exchange, the officers provided them with a cut of the proceeds. The HOA members involved in this arrangement were complicit, having facilitated the illegal fine collection process for months. This coordinated effort was well disguised by the use of official citations, seemingly legitimate police involvement, and the constant pressure from Karen. Homeowners who had received fines never questioned their legitimacy because they were delivered by uniformed officers with official-looking documentation. Even those who suspected foul play were reluctant to challenge the citations, as it seemed like a losing battle against both law enforcement and the HOA. The scam was revealed after a thorough audit of the financial records associated with the fine collection system. Investigators traced the funds back to an unregistered P.O. box and uncovered a series of transfers to personal bank accounts tied to the rogue officers and their collaborators. The officers involved had intentionally used vague and broad language in their citations, such as violation of public safety codes or failure to maintain property standards, to ensure that their actions were difficult to challenge. Most citations did not refer to specific laws or codes, leaving homeowners with no clear path to contest the fines. One of the most striking elements of the scam was the way in which the officers had manipulated the legal process. They would often issue fines for offenses that in reality had no clear legal standing. For example, fines for mailboxes that were too close to the sidewalk or not reflective enough were issued without any supporting ordinance to back them up. These vague violations made it difficult for residents to contest the fines, and the overwhelming volume of tickets discouraged them from attempting to fight back. The officers involved had developed a highly effective system that preyed on homeowners' desire to avoid legal trouble and the fear of escalating fines. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Karen had unknowingly acted as a catalyst for the scam. Her obsessive complaints about mailbox violations had put the entire neighborhood under a microscope, allowing the officers to identify potential targets. Without Karen's campaign, the officers would likely have been unable to gather the volume of complaints needed to justify their actions. Her focus on mailbox violations and her constant calls to both the HOA and the police had created the perception that there was a widespread issue, when in reality, it was a manufactured crisis designed to enrich a few corrupt individuals. Karen's role in the scam was both ironic and tragic. She had set out with the intention of making her neighborhood a better place, but in doing so, she had inadvertently enabled a criminal enterprise. The officers, who had initially relied on her complaints to fuel their operations, turned their attention to her when they realized she was one of the few residents who had not yet been targeted by their scheme. They saw an opportunity to manipulate Karen directly, convincing her that the only way to fix the neighborhood was to continue pushing for even stricter enforcement of mailbox rules. In turn, Karen unknowingly provided them with the cover they needed to continue their illegal activities. As the full scope of the scam was revealed, the community's outrage grew. What had started as a petty dispute over mailboxes had evolved into a deeply troubling case of police corruption and financial exploitation. The revelation that law enforcement officers had used their power to manipulate the system and profit off of false citations sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Trust in local authorities and the HOA was shattered, and the community was left grappling with the fallout from the scandal. The exposure of the scam ultimately led to the firing of the corrupt officers, the resignation of several HOA members involved in the kickback scheme, and a complete overhaul of the HOA's policies regarding rule enforcement. The local government also initiated a broader investigation into police practices, with several officers facing criminal charges related to the illegal fine collection operation. The HOA, under intense pressure, was forced to implement stricter oversight procedures to ensure that such abuses of power would never occur again. Once the full extent of the corruption was revealed, the community's outrage quickly turned into action. Residents, armed with evidence and determination, made it clear that they would not let the corrupt officers or the HOA get away with exploiting them. The small problem of mailbox violations had uncovered a massive scheme that preyed on homeowners, and now the community was determined to seek justice. What began as a few concerned individuals grew into a united front, fighting back against the corruption that had festered within their neighborhood. The first step in the community's fight back was legal action. Homeowners, led by a group of lawyers who had been following the case, began organizing a class action lawsuit against the officers involved in the scam. They sought to hold the rogue officers accountable not just for their legal actions, but also for the emotional and financial distress they had caused to the residents. The lawsuit demanded compensation for the unjust fines that had been issued, and also called for criminal charges to be brought against the officers who had been part of the scheme. With the evidence gathered by the community, the case was strong and public support was overwhelming. The legal battle quickly gained attention in the media, further amplifying the pressure on local authorities to act. The case was no longer just about a neighborhood dispute. It had become a symbol of the abuse of power by law enforcement and the corruption that could thrive within local government institutions. News outlets covered the story extensively, highlighting the role of the officers, the HOA's involvement, and the toll the scam had taken on residents. The more the public learned about the scam, the more outraged they became, leading to even greater scrutiny of the local police department and the HOA's operations. As the legal action progressed, pressure mounted on the local government to respond. Public outcry forced officials to take action, and investigations into the corrupt officers were launched. Several of the officers involved in the scam were suspended, and eventually criminal charges were filed against them. They faced charges ranging from bribery and fraud to conspiracy and misconduct. The case highlighted how deeply entrenched the corruption had been, with the officers using their positions of power to generate illicit income and exploit vulnerable homeowners. The officers who had been responsible for the scam were ultimately dismissed from the police department, and their careers were destroyed. However, the fight didn't end with the legal victories. The neighborhood knew that in order to prevent future abuses of power, structural changes were needed both in the police department and within the HOA. The community's collective voice called for comprehensive reforms in local law enforcement practices, demanding greater accountability and transparency. Residents pushed for a more rigorous review of officer conduct, stronger oversight mechanisms, and an independent body to investigate complaints against law enforcement. They insisted that future enforcement of local ordinances, even those as minor as mailbox maintenance, be subject to clear and transparent regulations to prevent any individual or group from exploiting it for personal gain. In addition to reforms within the police department, the HOA came under intense scrutiny. The board members who had been complicit in the scam resigned, and the remaining members were forced to address the severe lapses in governance that had allowed the scam to flourish. the HOA implemented a series of reforms to ensure that there was no opportunity for similar abuses of power in the future. These included stricter guidelines for enforcement, regular audits of financial records, and a new policy of transparency where all fines and violations would be publicly documented and easily accessible to homeowners. The community's fight was not just a victory for the residents who had been directly affected by the scam, but a broader victory for everyone in the neighborhood. In the end, the residents learned an invaluable lesson: the true power of standing together. What had begun as a small, seemingly trivial issue over mailbox maintenance had revealed a deep-seated culture of corruption and exploitation. The neighborhood's response showed that when people come together and demand accountability, they can achieve real change. The victory also demonstrated the importance of remaining vigilant and questioning authority when something seems off. If the homeowners had simply accepted the fines without protest, the corruption might have continued unchecked. It was only through their collective efforts that they were able to expose the truth and bring those responsible to justice. This victory wasn't just about winning a legal case, it was about reclaiming their community and restoring trust in the systems that were meant to protect them. As a result of the lawsuit and the media attention it generated, other neighborhoods began to take notice. The community's actions set a precedent for what could be achieved when residents stood up to corruption and demanded change. Other homeowners associations and local police departments across the country began reassessing their own practices, ensuring that their enforcement procedures were transparent and fair. The ripple effect of the neighborhood's fight for justice was felt far beyond their own town, as it sparked a broader conversation about the need for police reform, better governance in homeowners associations, and the importance of holding corrupt officials accountable. Ultimately, the neighborhood emerged stronger and more united than ever before. The corrupt officers and the complicit HOA board members were held accountable, and reforms were put in place to ensure that such abuses would not happen again. The residents had fought back and won, not just for themselves, but for the integrity of their community and the protection of their rights. They had learned the hard way that small problems, when left unchecked, could lead to massive corruption. But they had also learned that with unity, perseverance, and a commitment to justice, they could overcome even the most daunting challenges. Don't miss out on more shocking stories like this. Subscribe to Expect Stories now.